In 2006, we went overseas to do a survey trip, which is what people do when they're thinking about doing mission work. So we went over, we visited a team. We had a great time. I was actually pregnant at the time. I was about 5 months pregnant, and we were like out in the village setting, and I would even like have to sleep on the wooden slatted floor over the ocean sometimes those nights. And it was just a really awesome trip. It was a beautiful experience, and we really fell in love with that location, and we ended up living there eventually. But when we came back from that survey trip, I started having trouble with my voice. And at first it was kind of like it was just sore, maybe like laryngitis, and it kept going and it kept going. And I went to my doctor, and he was like, oh, let's try this antibiotic. Oh, that didn't work. Let's try it again. Oh, that's weird. That still didn't work. And eventually I was diagnosed with a catastrophic vocal cord injury that is very rare. And I was actually blessed by getting into a really high-level otolaryngologist in Boston, where they were able to, they put this small machine in your mouth, and they run sound waves into your vocal cords so you're not speaking at all, and they can watch your vocal cords while they're moving so they can see what the dysfunction is. And so this was in 2006, and that technology was brand new. So I was really thankful that I was able to get that, but it was really hard because I was actually at that appointment alone, and I was pregnant, and I didn't expect there to be bad news, so I didn't bring anybody with me. And when the doctor came in, he brought a counselor with him, and he said...
Never good news.
Yeah. He said, I'm so sorry, I have to tell you that you have a catastrophic vocal cord injury, and when we see this injury, we know that you're only going to have a handful of years left with your voice, and it will degenerate over the course of some time. We don't know how long, and eventually you're going to have to use a vocal computer to speak. And it was devastating, as you can imagine. I was actually a singer, so I was a national champion singer in high school and led worship, and that was a huge part of my spirituality. So it was a deeply painful, shocking experience. I did not have any clue. I was just going and thinking maybe it was like a nodule or something more normal, or like, that they could do surgery or something. So over the course of the next 10 years, I had very severe vocal cord pain every day of my life. And I, knew that it was degenerating. I didn't know how long I would have it. And every day that I used my voice, I felt like I was spending currency that I could never get back. So it was so hard because I had little kids. So, even if I had to, one of my little ones was running out in the street, I would be so scared to even yell at them because I was terrified I was going to rupture it further. And we ended up having to homeschool. So I had to figure out how to homeschool without really being able to speak very much. I couldn't read any books aloud to my children. There were certain things that were much more painful than others. I couldn't do any ministry that I felt called to do or gifted to do. I couldn't teach. I couldn't, speak from the front. I couldn't lead worship. And it was just such a painful experience. I think the hardest part was I kind of felt trapped in my body because I looked normal, but I couldn't get out sound without being in pain. And also just the knowledge of what was coming down the road, that it would be gone eventually. And so during that time, there was a real deepening that happened inside where it felt like learning to commune with the Lord, in a one-on-one way, because I'm a real extrovert. So up until that point, I'd always go for people, talk to people. And during that time, it really taught me to move inward to the Lord. And it was like a deep internal sense of coming to Jesus as my only companion. He was like a sheep that was led to the slaughter, like a sheep who was silent. And so I had a lot of union with him in that, but it was still so painful to know that, one day, this is coming. And it felt so threatening. And I had to weigh every opportunity, should I use my voice for this or not? Because, this could damage it further. But it didn't really continue to get worse. And then in 2016, one of our supporters was a child otolaryngologist, and he had really high-level connections from when he was in medical school. And he figured out our whole home assignment schedule, and he figured out the best vocal place for me to get a checkup and scheduled it for me. So it was amazing. So he looked at our schedule, and we got me into this place called Lions Voice Center in Minneapolis. And I was just there to visit our supporters and people that cared about us. And my supporters were like, we need to make sure they took care of my kids because they thought I was going to get bad news. I would need to have my husband with me. So, he came with me and we go in. And they had my records from Boston in 2006, and they had the same machine. This is 10 years later. They did the test, and then they brought all these doctors in. And they were like, look at this. And you could see the two panels. And the old scar, like on the top third of my vocal cords could not touch at all. And the new picture was actually, I had complete, full, perfect vocal cords, and the scar was much farther off, like off to the side where it was like on the flesh. And they said, back when we first were discovering this injury, when our technology was newer, we thought that nobody's vocal cords could ever heal from this. We thought that this was damage that was permanent. But now we know some people actually get their vocal cords actually can regrow. And I was like, well, why has it been hurting so much? Like, why does it still hurt? And they said, well, you've been using these muscles to push your voice together, which is what you had to do because your vocal cords weren't working. But now you need to learn to speak normally again. So I went back to physical therapy. And since that was right after that was when I went back to seminary and was able to like go into my own like full-time ministry and take on a lot more work that I feel called to do. But I think that as I look back on that, that's when I became really passionate about how God uses suffering in our lives to form us. And that's led me to where I am now in my academic work and studying like people from the past and how God has formed them through their suffering and what practices did they use to bolster their courage in the midst of their suffering. And for me, I know it was like a hollowing out, like it was like hollowing out the container of my soul to make more space for God. Through losing so much capacity, it was like in my weakness that he brought me to himself.
Right. Wow. That's an amazing story. Okay, so just to back up a little bit. So you went on your vision trip to Southeast Asia, right? You came back and you discovered you had this catastrophic, like life-changing injury, right? That not only is just terrible in and of itself, but also affects your particular giftings and callings that the Lord has put on you, right? And then you decided to go to Southeast Asia anyway. So tell me a little bit about that and how you guys made that decision.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was a lot. It actually really just crystallized what my role had to be. Yeah. In a way, it was like it limited what my options were. And my husband is very gifted, and he was working with the local church in that area. And he had a visa to work among the local church and to work in seminaries and train local pastors. And so what it did was it just really crystallized my role, and I ended up being able to really stabilize our family in the midst of multiple moves.
Right.
We lived on 3 different islands. We had 2 different teams over the course of those 11 years. And I was able to provide like a really stable space for the family and provide a lot of continuity for our kids while my husband ended up traveling. And, I had to reconcile to myself, I feel called to be doing this work. And somehow I had to appropriate the job of being the stable person, the anchor in the home, as being actually real mission work. And that I was able to do that. I was able to make a shift mentally to, it's okay. And this is what I'm able to do now. And I think our kids really did well because they did have one person who was really dedicated to that space. And that I kind of just had to make the best of it.
Right. Because I can imagine, I've definitely heard of a lot of women who they go overseas, and that's a real struggle for them when they kind of have to be doing homeschool and taking care of the family and the home and doing sort of all these sort of more traditional roles that a lot of American women are not used to anymore. And then seeing their husband get to go and do kind of like all the glorious sort of stuff. So, that must have been a little bit of a transition for you.
Yeah, it was hard because, since I was at camp in 8th grade, I felt called to be in ministry, and so for me, I actually think it was almost a gift of grace because by removing the possibility, it just made it like, well, this is the option that I have. If we want to be doing this work, this is the way it's going to have to look. And I was able to really kind of find ways to work around it. Like I was able to still do a lot of one-on-one conversation. So I did a lot of discipling with women who were college aged, and I had a vibrant group of about 20 girls that I walked with through their lives. I was there when they had their first babies. I was there when they got married. And so I probably wasn't taking on like the front person the way I might naturally want to be up in front teaching or something like that. But I was able to grow in that one-on-one discipleship mode. And then I made my home much more of a hospitable space and learned how to do that. and make that a welcoming space and provide opportunities for people to meet together there. So, and then I also did a large ministry where I taught women how to study the Bible on their own. And so I wasn't leading from the front, but I taught them how to read the Bible in a way where they could go deeper with it. And we would meet together in community and talk as a group. So they weren't relying on me because I couldn't be at the front like I would probably want to do. But I was still able to teach them a method for learning to read the Bible and study it on their own. So I feel like in a way it kind of like directed me on this side path that I would have never gone down, that both formed me spiritually, but also grew gifts that I probably would have never invested in on my own.
Yeah. That like opportunity just to invest so much in those individual lives in such like a significant way, especially during this period of your life when you were going through a lot of other stuff, traumatic stuff in your life. I mean, that's such an incredible like opportunity that you're given. And I can imagine just like the fruit that will come that you'll maybe get to hear about more of, you know, in the future one day in heaven or whatever. So
yeah, it's cool. You can actually keep up with people now on
that's
Facebook.
true.
And, you know, I'm still friends with them. We still connect. That's what's so cool about it is I think back in the day, once you moved, you would have to break that relationship. But now, like, I'm kind of journeying with them still on WhatsApp. So it's pretty cool.
It's cool.
So now you're back here in the U.S. and working on our member development team. And your work is focused on caring for people that were in your shoes, maybe not dealing with the exact same challenges that you were as far as suffering, but their own suffering that they are bringing with them. So can you tell us a little bit about what you do here now with our field workers?
Sure. Yeah, we have a really vibrant team of about 20 people in member development here, and our whole job is to help our missionaries thrive on the field. My particular role is to care for the adult missionaries that live in certain regions. And so I walk with them, I journey with them, we check in, we talk as needed, care for them, and I provide a lot of resources. I also develop and run our component of the launch, which is our preparation for the outgoing missionaries. So I'm in charge of kind of making sure our trainers have what they need, developing their curriculum. I'm very passionate about preparing new missionaries. And so I've put a lot of time and energy with my team into developing a more robust curriculum for new missionaries that matches what the field wanted here with Pioneers. So our department is just so passionate about helping people thrive. And it's a huge asset. You know, if you're thinking about coming with Pioneers, know that we are not just about getting you on the field. We're about helping you stay and thrive.
Now, one phrase that you've mentioned several times is spiritual formation. Can you maybe define what you mean by that for us?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Yes, I think of spiritual formation as the activity with God of discipleship, of growth, of change and transformation over the course of your life. Like, I think about that one little phrase in Romans 12 that says, be transformed. It's the same root, formed. What does it mean? How are we transformed? It is actually a divine passive. It is something that it's imperative. God is telling you, you have to do it, but you can't do it yourself. Be transformed.
Right.
So a lot for me of spiritual formation is providing practices and resources to get in the space for God to do his work. You're not going to be formed if you're out here always working, always doing stuff. You have to sit down. You have to get in communities where you're going to grow. You have to sit with your Bible and be in certain spaces where it's going to actually cultivate that growth. So that's kind of how I think of spiritual formation, is being in the pathway of transformation.
Yeah. That's so interesting because you would think, right? So, because obviously you're doing this kind of work and training and providing resources for people who are on the field, for current workers, missionaries, right? But from like the average person's standpoint, right? Like, missionaries should already be pretty like high up there on like the spiritual level scale, so to speak, right? So it's sort of like, how much further do they have to go? So, and then on top of that, because they are working, and so they're like busy doing stuff all the time, right?
Yeah.
So when they're busy like evangelizing and planning churches and learning the language and all that, I mean, how do they find time to like get away from that and do kind of this like quiet, you know, you pull yourself away and, you know, meditate on the Lord or whatever it is that it takes. So, I mean, speaking to a little bit of that kind of, like missionaries already should be up there, shouldn't they?
Yeah, well, we absolutely want our missionaries to be godly, mature people.
Right.
And yet we're all human beings, right? And we all come and we're launched in the season of life where we're at. So we're all growing. We don't expect our missionaries to be perfect. We don't expect them to already have it all. I think a lot of times when you read about missionary biographies and you get ready to become a missionary, you're like, I'm going to get on the plane and I'm going to walk out and I'm going to be like Amy Carmichael. And the moment I step on the field, I will be able to convert the masses, But you're still your same person with all your same sin, your same temptation. You carry your story with you. And you only know what you know now. God takes us to different layers at different seasons in our lives. So you might come to a season in your 30s that's different than it was in your 20s when you left for the field. And in your 30s and you have a child and you look in the eyes of your 4-year-old and you realize, wow, I was really wounded when I was 4 years old, by this experience that I had. But I didn't really work on that until I had a 4-year-old. Mm-hmm. So those kinds of things are the layers and the depths that God works on. You're not ever arrived in your spiritual life. We all need to constantly be working on internal transformation with Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so in the second part about how does that work when we have so much to do on the field, right? We want to go, we need to plant our churches, we need to do these things. That's absolutely true. But one of the classic metaphors that you see in scripture about abiding is that concept that growth only happens when you're planted and your roots are down deep in soil that's nourishing you. Right. And so for me, it's more about cultivating rich soil and providing opportunities for the soil for growth. And as I'm in those opportunities where I am going to grow because I have a faithful community or I'm spending time with the Lord in prayer or journaling and reading my Bible, then I can expect to grow and to bear fruit because I am doing both. Right. I am out and would say, hey, it looks like, you're thinking about this. How about this book? They would offer new opportunities and new resources to me that I wouldn't have had if I hadn't asked them. And that's actually part of my job and my role now when I'm talking with the missionaries on the field as they experience new things, to offer them things that they don't know about. So they might be struggling with, they can't get their visa. So then, I could tell them a story about my life, and then I offer them, a new resource of what to do when, you there's no pathway open for you or something like that. So I think one of the biggest things is involving yourself with other people and sharing and being open in community with other people. And that was what I did. And she's still with me now. Yeah. So it's been a really powerful relationship, a transformational relationship for me to go to those deepest levels with her over time.
Yeah. I think one of the things, you mentioned the people that you had in your life that were mentors within the mission world or your church world back home. You served in a place that has many unreached people groups, but also there is a vibrant church there, growing bodies of believers that are local there. Are there things that you learned from them in terms of facing suffering and enduring and spiritual formation that maybe you wouldn't have gotten
Absolutely.
elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a great question. For us, there was two things that really come to mind that I learned about suffering from the country and the people that I live with. And one of the main things that I learned was through the process of what it meant to go through grief. In America, my experience, typically, it's very private. When a person dies, we go private. We are alone. We're away. We kind of want our space and we're alone. And even the way that we celebrate our funerals are very detached from the person often. And in the location where we were, there was no distance from the person. So they would lay out the dead body of the beloved person, and you would come close and you would touch them and you would speak to that person, and then they would quickly bury it, and we would do it together, and you would be singing songs. You would be walking through the whole village together with this body. And then you go and walk to the communal burial ground and place the body in the ground.
So you could also be a part of this, like walking through it, even if it's not necessarily like your best friend.
I was much more a part of it than I wanted to be, honestly. Yeah, so if you were a woman, you were invited in to prepare the body.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so I was a part of that process as well. Yeah. And so I think it really helped me understand the disconnect we have a little bit with the process of dying, but also how much grief is more powerful, and it's actually almost more efficient in a community experience.
Yeah.
Not in a way of like trying to push through it faster, but in a sense of going deeper together, because you're not alone in your private world all by yourself, but you're able to share together. And some of my friends, they would get together, we'd be at the funerals, they would just be throwing themselves in my arms, weeping out loud, which was important to do because it actually honored the person who had passed away by wailing and weeping in a very loud way. It was honoring of the dead. But it also, I could see what a benefit it gave to her to be able to do that in community and to just be free with the loss that she was experiencing. So that's one thing. And then the other thing about suffering in general that I learned living overseas is just how protected we are here from suffering. I mean, we obviously live in a very prosperous country with, so much just infrastructure available to so many of us. Of course, not everyone, but most of us have access to medical care. Most of us have access to our basic needs. And just seeing what it was like for my close friends to live off of $200 or $300 a month and to do so with joy and to share freely with one another, and they would try to share with me, and it was just something that kind of blew my mind of how just connected they were with their reality and how much bigger capacity they had to suffer, honestly. And have you guys ever heard of the biodome 2? This is like an analogy we talk about a little bit in my role. There's this biodome where they created the perfect atmosphere for all plants to thrive.
Oh, I think I have heard
this, and they found out through this biodome that trees need wind in order to grow, because the trees that were inside the biodome were just collapsing under the fact that they were not receiving wind. The wind actually creates a certain kind of resistance in the bark and an enzyme that helps the bark get firm. And I think that's an example of, like, we think about suffering as something bad. I have to get away. It doesn't feel good. But actually, a little bit of suffering creates resilience and helps us be stronger. And I think that's what I learned from my friends there in that country, was that they had suffered a lot, but they didn't see it all as suffering the way I did. Just because they lived with a dirt floor, they didn't even see that as a bad thing. That was normal to them. And they had created such a bigger capacity to endure and experience loss and experience lack that just blew me out of the water. And it really, to this day, it has changed me. It's changed what I think I need to have in order to be happy, because I could see that they were happy with very little. They were happy to be together, and they were happy to be able to worship freely,
Right. Yeah. I mean, so like what you said about how, like, in the U.S., like, we are very protected. It's a very prosperous nation. There's a lot of, systems in place to help us when we are not doing well, right? And so I think it's often easy, especially for younger people, to be like, to kind of like tamp down on any suffering that they have had, because they're like, oh my goodness, like, I should not be complaining if I compare myself to people in Southeast Asia or people in Africa or whatnot, right? So what would you say to people like that who just say, like, oh, I'm just going to ignore my suffering because really it's nothing compared to what other people have experienced?
Well, I think that's a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
Because I think the best option is when God invites you. You think of suffering as an invitation. God doesn't cause suffering, but he allows it to be a pathway. That's the paradox.
Right.
The paradox is he does not cause it, but that he makes it somehow produce resurrection in our lives. It's like built into creation that things that fall down and die come back to new life. Like the seed that goes into the ground and dies bears fruit for discipleship. It makes no sense. That's the kingdom that's built into the world that we live in. In the same way for us, embracing the opportunity, the suffering that we have as an opportunity for depth to be transformed. In my perspective, that's that same pathway. Suffering produces perseverance, character, and character hope. And so you see God actually laid that out for us. So instead of saying, oh, that's not bad, saying this is real and this is an opportunity for me to go into this pain with Jesus, you know, like you see him doing in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Right. Yeah.
He wasn't like, oh, it's no big deal, guys. You know, he was like, take this cup from me. That was his example to us, was to say, please, Father, not my will, but yours be done. But I will do this, you know, to the point of sweating blood.
Yeah.
He was in agony, you know, but he took the path of suffering. And that's what bore new life and resurrection for us.
Yeah, sure.
We've seen, you've mentioned that a lot of this has driven deeper interest in you in studying this. And I know that you're working on graduate studies in the area of spiritual formation, but not necessarily what happens now, but how people in the past grew in their faith. Can you talk a little bit about what you're learning and what you're studying related to that?
Sure. I'm still early. I'm just started my PhD in spirituality and suffering. So it's really theology of suffering and practical theology. And I'm very passionate about people in history who have suffered and who have endured great suffering and who continue to turn to the Lord and allow that suffering to help them grow. And it started when I was in my master's program. I didn't mean to study this. I just like every time I didn't mean to study suffering. I was like, it's just something I was so curious about. It was like, it doesn't make any sense to me. You know, it's like, it's completely mind blowing. And to me, it's just such a example of the way that the paradox of new life is built into the world, that this is somehow the path of growth that God has for us. And so I'm so curious to see that unfold in people's lives. So every paper that I wrote for my master's, I did a master's in church history, I just ended up studying different people and how they suffered and what they did and what they learned and what can we learn from them. And it's been really cool and really actually quite practical. I know a lot of people think, history, what is that? You know, that's so boring. But I think we need to learn from the past. Just like we need to learn from other cultures, we need to learn from the past because God was there. He was present in the lives of our brothers and sisters who went before us. And there's so much that we can learn from them throughout time. And so one person that I really was interested in is Julian of Norwich. A lot of people are familiar with her, but she is a woman from about the 13th century, and she went through a period of very deep suffering where she almost died. And through that process went into this very deep season of getting to know the Lord. And she was a huge inspiration for C.S. Lewis, which was how I got interested in her, because he used a lot of her motifs in her books that she wrote that were about the ways that God revealed himself to her as he kind of unfolded Narnia. And she had this one idea that I think is just really fascinating, that she had this idea that if God came in his first time to us in the form of the incarnation, which no one expected, but in the incarnation resolved so many problems for us by dying on a cross, a way no one expected, then we should believe that the time he comes again is going to be just as unbelievable, unexpected, and powerful reformation. And so that's why in Narnia, spoiler alert, you have the Narnia within the Narnia. And because he was showing that there is something deeper that was going on here. And so she's someone that I just love to read her experience of God, because she saw him as her king. She experienced him both very immanent, so above, more powerful than her, but also immanent inside of her and close to her, but also transcendent and powerful over her. And in her mind, it was like the only path to think about God is that he's both near, as close as could be inside your very heart, but also ruling the whole world. Because he has to be near enough to love us, to want to help us, and powerful enough to do it. You know, and that's like a thought that I've carried with me a lot.
Yeah, I think we have perceptions of people in that day and age that they were living in the dark ages. They didn't know the things that we know. They might not have had all of the resources we have. Spiritually,
any of the resources.
We had. Their churches were corrupt, and so there's just all sorts of stereotypes about that. But it sounds like, as you're describing it, there are people that had real deep faith and understanding that of things that we don't know, that's maybe been lost to history. And so this is a process of kind of uncovering some of these things. And I know some of the things you've talked about, using this terminology like spiritual formation, there's practices that accompany this, right? I mean, I think most of us that were brought up in the church have an understanding of praying and reading your Bible every day and going to church and worshiping. And there's a few things that we all know are expected of us. But are there other things as well that maybe you've learned that practices or habits of people in ages past, and even missionaries even, that have helped them grow in their faith and overcome suffering and become even closer to God in the midst of whatever they're living in?
Yeah. Well, one thing that happened that was cool, because it actually intersected with my job here, is that I took this class called Reformation Era Spirituality. And so it was all about the spirituality of the Reformation era. And that's not my favorite era. It just feels like it's fraught with just so much tension, So I was like not looking forward to this class. And I asked, and we were supposed to write this one paper, and I was like, I don't want to write that. So I asked my professor if I could study suffering in the Reformation era and all of the strands of different types of faith within the Reformation era and how did they approach their suffering. And what I learned through that paper was that they were all praying through the Psalms when they suffered. And I basically developed a resource that we use here at our debriefing event for the missionaries. When the missionaries come back during their home assignment after 2 or 3 years for refreshment, they come here and we have this event for them. It's awesome. It's their kids get to come. It's so refreshing. And we have these different opportunities for them to connect with the Lord. And so I actually developed a workshop called Praying the Psalms where I taught them how to do that, because I think it's really accessible. You just come to the Psalms and you read through the Psalms and you see what comes up as you're reading. Some of the Psalms are just very painful. And they bring up a lot of our negative emotion, but in a way that's very safe because it's in the safety of Scripture. And these are words that were inspired, so we know that it's okay to talk to God this way. And so as we see David saying, deep calls to deep in the roar of his waterfalls, all your waves and breakers are crashing over me. We can also say, God, why are you letting this really difficult thing happen to me? That question Jesus asked on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Normalizing that kind of question and welcoming those kinds of questions in the presence of God through a journaling activity like praying the Psalms is something that our missionaries can do anywhere that they are all around the world.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, I mean, I know you've been talking a little bit about how you've been using, some of the stuff that you've studied and your experiences to minister to workers now. And, you're talking with them while they're on the field, after they come back from the field, all that. Like, what kind of stuff comes up? Like, what kind of issues? What kind of, are there any, themes or patterns that you've, noticed? Or, these are, something particularly that, for this generation, for example, that we really need to pay attention to?
Well, the number one thing that I think we need to be paying attention to is the loneliness. And I think that there's nothing wrong with being lonely. I think there are times and seasons when God calls us into places where we are alone. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus when he went out into the wilderness. So sometimes we are in places where we're alone. And actually that is an opportunity to welcome Jesus to be your friend, to be like your companion in that moment. But I noticed that I think because of social media, it's very hard for a lot of younger missionaries to just be alone for a while. It's not normal in our society. We're just inundated all the time with people that even sometimes that we don't know, that we feel like we're friends with, like celebrity people on bloggers, like blogger moms, stuff like that, that we can just saturate ourselves with that. And guess what? Even in the most remote places in Southeast Asia, you can get on the internet, you can get on Facebook, you can still connect with people. And so we found that there's actually a real problem for a lot of our missionaries in when they face that loneliness, because it's just so easy to move into, going back into my social media. Instead of saying, you know what, it's okay to be lonely right now. I am lonely. Of course, we're going to be lonely when we move to a new country. We don't know anyone yet. And so instead of just being patient and waiting for those relationships to come, it is very easy to just slide into what's normal for us and with social media. So that's one area where I think spiritual formation can be a benefit, because if you sit with the Lord and you're like, and you just allow the feelings to settle and you say, oh, I'm feeling lonely, and actually saying that to yourself rather than just going right to, you feel it, but you didn't acknowledge it, you didn't engage with God on it, but you just go then to social media. If we're able to allow those feelings to emerge and bring them to God and be like, this hurts, this is hard. Like, you know, just like Jesus was lonely, you know, there's a real communion with Jesus that can happen in that place. I know from my voice that is very lonely, you know, that you can go to a place of union with Christ in your loneliness that will deepen you to a place where you can have a sense of being with him and having solidarity with him, even when no one else is around. So that is one area where I think, you know, as in our organization, we talk about a lot, like how can we encourage our missionaries to just sit in that place and welcome Jesus into that space.
Yeah. I mean, I think that ties in so well with what you were saying earlier about how, you know, one way or another, you know, we kind of try and ignore the suffering. We're trying to tap it down or say it's like not a big deal, right? And so it's just kind of this tendency of people, especially like with all the inundation of like social media, right? To just kind of like skip over it and find ways to either like distract or find something else to do or whatnot, right? But what you're saying is to, you know, part of what the Lord is calling us to do in our suffering is to kind of just like sit in it, so to speak. You sit in it and you welcome him and you say, what do you have for me here? You know, where are you? Are you with me here? I'm really passionate about this one Old Testament theologian, Walter Brueggemann's work on the area of what Hesed love means, which we see it often it's translated as steadfast love and faithfulness. He's a Hebrew scholar, is very well known in the area of spirituality and lament. And he would translate the word Hesed love, steadfast love, as tenacious solidarity. So if you went through the Old Testament, every time you saw those words, steadfast love and faithfulness, and put in tenacious solidarity, what would happen? How would you see God differently? In your pain, when you feel alone, he's never leaving you. And I think there's a lot there in suffering with the solidarity that we have in Christ, that God is trying to create union with us in our suffering by being present with us. And you can't be present with him if you're on social media. You know, you're only present here, or you're reading, you know, inappropriate material, or like getting on YouTube or whatever you're doing, you know, to try to fill up that space. Right.
Yeah. And this is something I think people take for granted, that missionaries struggle with these same things. And they're in context where they don't necessarily have the same support structures to help them through it. And so it's important to have that foundation of spiritual maturity and, you know, kind of the ballast in your soul to help you get through these times, because there's not going to be someone there necessarily to help you. And I think what you're saying is that this is not an opportunity to self-medicate or to try to numb it, but to sit with it and to invite Jesus into it as well. And I've been noticing even more and more lately in, you know, you see this in stories online of people that were in missions and they left for one reason or another. They came home and now their views on what they were involved in might have changed. They might begin to have second thoughts. Some of them might even be deconstructing from their faith or moving into a version of faith that would even look down on what they were doing. And it does seem like some of the common denominators are suffering that was maybe not dealt with, or was maybe dealt with in a hurtful way by someone around them. And there wasn't an approach that allowed them the space to do that maybe. And I'm wondering if you've seen that maybe, or even the possibility of that happening even to some of the people that you've cared for and helped, and how you really help people process that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the problem of suffering because I like problems, and this problem is not going away, guys. This is like the problem. The problem of evil, the problem of suffering. It's the problem of our humanity that started with the fall and will stay with us until new creation when Jesus comes again. And when I think about, I do have a lot of friends that are struggling with deconstruction or doubting or experiencing a lot of confusion in their faith. And I have a very close loved one as well who has gone through that. And I think at the core, to me, I think that we think as Western Christians that we need to have an answer for every theological problem. And I need to have this exact formula. And we present our faith that way a lot of times. But we're not going to have that with suffering. You know, we have a Savior who died, you know, so that there's a paradox built in that what has been asked of us is to have faith. Faith implies that we will not have an answer.
Right.
So if you are trying to say, I have to have this answer in order to believe, then that's not faith. Faith, it's okay to doubt. It's okay even to have skepticism in my mind, because that implies, if you're holding to Jesus, that you have faith, because you're saying, I actually have questions, but I'm remaining and I'm sitting with him and I'm staying with him, even though there's doubt swirling, you know, even though people have let me down. You know, I've been hurt. I've had leaders that have failed me, you know, and I think those are all invitations to go back inward to the Lord with it and to be like, this person failed me. Guess what? Surprise, surprise. You know, we're all human. There's a lot of really, you know, broken people. And I feel like the way that American leadership structure as well is very, we've set ourselves up for this in a lot of ways. And that is another thing that I learned about in Southeast Asia, was just that communal relationships really held the faith together. You know, I didn't always have to have it together because I could rely on you. And you could be like, it's okay, we're doing this together. Come to church with me. And we're so individualistic in America. It's like I have to, in my head, have everything figured out inside my brain, instead of being like, hey, help me today. Hey, I need your help. And you'd be like, we're doing this together. Let's go. Yeah. And I think that's something that we're missing. And we're also missing the space for questions to just be unresolved, because there are going to be unresolved questions on planet Earth. That is that is the problem of the fall that we live with. So I think it's really hard. It really is.
Yeah. So much stuff. I mean, so deep. Like, I mean, it's funny because you're like, there's no answer. A lot of times, right? That's almost the answer, is that there is no answer, right? But then it's kind of amazing to think that, like, the problem of suffering is then what the Lord uses to then create rebirth and resurrection and all those things, right? So, I mean, just how that fits into the Lord's redemptive plan is kind of mind-blowing, especially when you, like, really start to kind of think about it, right?
I know. Yeah. Think about Job.
Yeah.
His friends all wanted to give him answers.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
You know, they all were like, what about this? What about this? It's this person's fault. It's that person's fault. In the end, what does Job say? I know that my Redeemer lives, and on that day he will stand upon the earth. There had never been a resurrection before. Right. How did he know that? Yeah. And the same thing with Abraham. When God called him to sacrifice his only son, the heir of the promise, he had to walk up Mount Moriah, which completely confounded the promise of God. Right. And he went up anyway, and it says later in the New Testament that he did it because he believed that God could create life from the dead and bring something back to life or create something that didn't exist. So he believed in resurrection too, and there had never been resurrection. So to me, it's like there has to be some kind of, that's the core, is that within the mystery, we don't have the answer, and that God is calling us to faith anyway. And it's the faith that always, for Abraham too, counted as righteousness.
Yeah.
Right.
Whew.
Well, thank you, Koko. Thank you for that. It's very encouraging. Now it is time for quick fire questions.
Oh, okay.
Transition.
See what happens. Yeah.
So you don't have to think too much about these questions. Just give us quick, instinctive answers that come to your mind. And if there's some you want to pass on, just say pass and we'll move on, because we've got plenty here. You ready?
Yep.
Okay. So most cultures are either tea cultures or coffee cultures. But as a person, are you tea person or a coffee person?
I'm tea in Southeast Asia, tea in Europe, coffee in America.
Okay.
Roman to the Romans.
It depends on where I feel.
Are you an early bird or a night owl?
I'm like a middle person.
Middle owl.
You know?
Okay.
Yeah. You
7 to 11. You know, let's not be crazy.
Yeah.
If you do stay up late, what is your go-to late night snack?
Oh, salted caramel. Chocolate covered salted caramels.
Oh.
Very
One a
specific.
night. I have one every night.
Okay.
Is there a specific brand that you like?
I typically just buy the ones at Costco because you can get so many, and the chocolate flavor is very good.
Yeah. That's so funny. It's like a ritual you have before you go to bed.
Yeah, but I mean a couple hours before bed. Let's not be crazy.
No, because we're not crazy.
Yeah, we're not crazy.
So winter, spring, summer, or fall?
I love the winter in my heart because I grew up going there with my family at Christmas, and I just love being in the cold, and I grew up skiing, so I love the winter. But after living in Southeast Asia, I can't be cold anymore. So I think I will have to change now and be more like an autumn person.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Window or aisle?
The aisle.
Yeah.
So I have to be able to get out. I don't like to feel trapped.
Yes. And if you're traveling, what is your must-pack item? You can't say Bible either. Everybody says Bible.
No,
But that's
like wake up because we do a lot of travel, like international, really far travel, and you have jet lag, and then you have to go to a meeting, and you're tired, so you're just like, "Oh, we're fine."
That's like straight espresso or something, isn't it?
Straight up,
stuff.
yeah.
Yes.
And I hardly ever use it, but it's just knowing that it's
Knowing
in my
it's there.
purse. I just feel like I have power.
Yeah. Yeah. What's your favorite local dish where you lived in Southeast Asia?
I really loved like a noodles with chicken and like spinach and kind of like a little bit of a sweet soy kind of flavor.
Is it spicy or
I don't like it spicy. You can always add more spice.
Yep.
But I didn't like it very spicy. Yeah. And my kids, because they were born over there, they loved it. They put it on, I just dump it on their high chair and they'd just be like this. And they would hold it like this. And the noodles were just like hanging,
going everywhere.
Yeah. That's cool. How about a talent that you wish you had?
I wish I could play the piano like you, Matt.
Oh, thanks. How about a missed comfort from home?
From home, like growing up, or from where I lived?
Well, when you lived overseas, what was a comfort from here that you missed?
Oh, that's a good question.
You can ask if you want.
Answer.
Maybe you were just completely satisfied and happy.
You're just
so full of the Lord's provision. You didn't have to think about home.
I really miss like workout classes. I know that's not like a comfort from home, but it's like something you could not replicate.
Right.
You know, so I love working out in groups.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know.
That's a good answer. So extroverted.
Yeah, so extroverted. I can't even work out by myself.
Is there a strange tradition that you witnessed? You described the burial. That's pretty strange.
Yeah. I mean, in some places, there's some really interesting, like where they will take the ashes of the deceased and like put it in a paper mache kind of a coffin and like send it out into the ocean. Yeah, that's really interesting because you actually watch them burn the body inside of a large paper mache kind of structure, and then they
that's a lot of paper
gather all that. Yeah, then they gather all the ashes and then they take it out to the ocean and send it out. Yeah, that was really interesting to see. Yeah. But I wasn't really ever part of that closely.
Right.
Any funny language mishap that you recall?
Let's see.
And
that I could share in this setting. I think I'm gonna pass.
Okay.
Yeah, mine is too. You'll have to ask me later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. One more question. What did you want to be when you were a kid?
When I was a kid, I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh.
I don't know where I got that idea.
Yeah.
It's very specific.
Yeah.
Not just a surgeon, but an orthopedic one.
I don't even think I knew what that word meant.
It sounds kind of fancy.
Yeah, I think it seemed fancy and like really technical.
Sounds cool.
And I was like, ooh, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, no, this has been so great. Everything that you shared about suffering, I think that's just so important to the discussion on missions and especially for those who are considering missionary work. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.